Here's how I recommend that you approach questions on the digital SAT writing section that ask you to complete the text so it conforms to the conventions of standard English. What I want you to do is take a look at your answer choices first and identify what you ultimately need to discover or identify as you do your initial read through in order to answer the question. So in this case, when we glance at our answer choices, we see that they are all pronouns. They, one, you, and it are all pronouns. So now what I'm going to do is, as I do my read through, I'm going to be looking for what the noun is that I'd be replacing with this pronoun. So let's go ahead and read through. We have public awareness campaigns about the need to reduce single-use plastics can be successful, says researcher Kim Borg of Monash University in Australia. When these campaigns give consumers a choice, for example, Japan achieved a 40% reduction in plastic bag use after cashiers were instructed to ask customers whether, and now we have our pronoun here, blank wanted a bag. Well, we'd be asking the customers whether they want a bag. Okay, and as you can see, customers is plural. And since customers is plural, the pronoun that replaces it cannot be singular. So our answer would have to be A, since that is the only pronoun out of A, B, C, and D, which is plural. So as you can see, by recognizing what we need to identify during our read through, we're able to be more efficient on the writing section. Here's a second example of how I recommend approaching questions that ask you to complete the text so it conforms to the conventions of standard English. So same approach. You're going to start by looking at your answer choices, identify what the difference is between all of them. In this case, we see it's punctuation. So now what we're going to be looking for as we go through the text and read it is, do we have an independent clause before this punctuation? Do we have an independent clause after it? What kind of phrase or clause do we have after it? What kind of phrase or clause do we have before it? So we have, in ancient Greece, an Epicurean was a follower of Epicurus, a philosopher whose beliefs revolved around the pursuit of pleasure. Epicurus defined pleasure as the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. Okay, so that's an independent clause. Next, we have positing that all life's virtues derived from this absence. That is not an independent clause. Okay, that's a participial phrase. Now, one thing you can note is that if you have something that, or a phrase that ends in, or if you have a word that ends in ing or ed that starts off a phrase, okay, there's a decent chance you might be looking at a participial phrase. So understand that. So in this case, we have this ing, okay, so that's indicative that you should be looking for a participial phrase. And in this case, we do have one. Now, a participial phrase is not an independent clause. So since it's not an independent clause, we can get rid of D. Next, between B and C, we see that one uses a colon, one uses a semicolon. However, when you're connecting a participial phrase to a main clause, you would either use a comma, an em dash, or no punctuation if it's already integrated. Okay, so you would not be using a colon or a semicolon. In this case, we use a comma, which is perfect. Okay, so our answer would have to be A. So once again, key thing to recognize with a question like this, which is just the question type of complete the text or conforms to conventions of standard English, begin by taking a look at your answer choices, identify the differences, identify what you need to look for before you do your read through of the text, and then as you do your read through of the text, identify what it is that you were searching for. In this case, it's, was there an independent clause before this punctuation? Is there an independent clause, or what kind of phrase are we dealing with afterwards? And then identify the correct punctuation for that. Because this question type is so common on the digital SAT writing section, I want to give a third example of it. So we have which choice completes the text so it conforms to the conventions of standard English. You'll begin by taking a look at your answer choices again. In this case, we see the difference is whether we're using they are, it is, their, which is plural and possessive, it's, which is singular and possessive. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. We'll go through, we'll identify what we're looking for. In this case, we're looking for what is the number of our subject and is it possessive. Okay, so we've got British scientists James Watson and Francis Crick won the Nobel Prize in part for their 1953 paper announcing the double helix structure of DNA, but it is misleading to say that Watson and Crick discovered the double helix. Okay, and then we have blank's findings were based on a famous X-ray image of DNA fibers, photo 51, developed by X-ray crystallographer Rosalind Franklin and her graduate student Raymond Gosling. Well, the subject is Watson and Crick, okay? So two people, so we have a plural subject, so we can get rid of B and we can get rid of D. Now keep in mind that it is their findings. They do own the findings. It is possessive. So plural and possessive means our answer there would have to be C. Option A is they are, which is not possessive. Okay, option C is plural possessive, so our answer there would have to be C. Because this question type on the digital SAT writing section is so common, I'm going to go ahead and give a few more examples. So we have answer choices A through D is where we're going to start. We're going to identify the differences between them. Okay, so you have a comma here and here, but not here and here. We have commas in options A, B, and D after chin, but not in option C. And then we have commas after claim. So ultimately, I'm looking for a couple things. First thing I'm going to look for is if Steina chin is non-essential, because that would get rid of options A and B or C and D, depending on whether it is non-essential or not. Okay, and then the next difference I'll be looking for is if I need to have a comma after claims. So it looks like if we look up, claims is before this quote, so whether or not that quote is integrated or not. If it's integrated, we will not need a comma. If it is not integrated, then we would need a comma. So let's go ahead and take a look. We've got in 1937, Chinese-American screen actor Anna May Wong, who had portrayed numerous villains and secondary characters but never a heroine, finally got a starring role in Paramount Pictures' Daughter of Shanghai, a film that critic Stina Chin claims expanded the range of possibilities for Asian images on screen. All right, well, we've got a film that critic Stina Chin claims expanded the range, okay? If we were to remove Stina Chin, we would have a film that critic claims expanded the range. Well, we'd have to say a critic if we're going to remove Stina Chin. We couldn't just say critic claims. We'd have to say a critic claims. Okay, so we can go ahead and get rid of A and B because we know that it is essential. Okay, the meaning would change if we were to remove Stina Chin. Let's go and take a look at C and D. We have critic Stina Chin claims, and then we go straight into the quote versus a comma before claims and a comma after claims. Well, we already know we don't need a comma before claims, so just based on that, we could get rid of D. But I also want to just add an option E here, and let's talk about what the case would be if we had critic Stina Chin claims and then a comma. Okay, so let's just pretend that this was an option as well. Well, if we go up, we've got a film that critic Stina Chin claims expanded the range of possibilities for Asian images on screen. As you can see, that's already integrated into the text, which means that since it's integrated into the text, we do not need a comma there. Okay, so E would also be incorrect if that were to be some answer choice. Okay, so our answer there would have to be answer choice C. Okay, so once again, to kind of sum all of this up, okay, we begin by looking at the differences in our answer choice. From there, we identify what we need to look for in the question as we do our read through. Once we identify those things, we come down, we eliminate wrong answer choices and get to the right one. Here's another example of how I recommend you approach questions that ask you to conform to the conventions of standard English. So I'd start by taking a look at my answer choices. In this case, we've got a version of claim in all of them. So what I'll be looking for is my subject. I want to know the number of my subject. And I also want to know what tense I'm in. So let's go ahead and go through number 23. In 1637, the price of tulips skyrocketed in Amsterdam, with single bulbs of rare variety selling for up to the equivalent of $200,000 in today's US dollars. Some historians blank, okay, so we got historians as our subject, that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, which occurs when investors drive prices to highs not supported by actual demand. All right, so before this comma, we need to have an independent clause. Okay, so in order to have an independent clause, we need to have a finite verb after historians. Okay, so let's take a look at our options. We got option A, some historians claiming that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble. Okay, now since we don't have an independent clause following this comma, we cannot use claiming here. Okay, because if we were to say some historians claiming that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, that's just not an independent clause. Okay, so we can get rid of option A. We would have some historians claim that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble. That would make an independent clause, and claim is a finite verb. Okay, so we have an independent clause in B, so B will be our answer there. Let's take a look at C and D as well. We've got option C, some historians having claimed that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble. This prevents essentially very close to the same problem as A. We are using a non-finite participle, and this will not complete an independent clause. So if we were to use having claimed, we would not have an independent clause before the comma. Okay, and if we're going to have a sentence, we need to have an independent clause. So we can get rid of option C. If we were to take a look at option D, okay, we would have some historians to claim that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble. Once again, that would not make an independent clause. Okay, to claim there is a non-finite infinitive. So we can get rid of D because once again, we would not have an independent clause. The only option out of A, B, C, and D that would give us an independent clause prior to this comma right here, okay, is option B because it provides a finite verb. Here's another example. We have which choice completes the text so it conforms to conventions of standard English. I look at my options. I've got food with a colon, a comma, no comma and well, or nothing, no punctuation after it. Okay, so what I'll be looking for is, do I have an independent clause before food? And then what kind of phrase or clause do I have after food? So we have researchers studying magnetosensation have determined why some soil-dwelling roundworms in the southern hemisphere move in the opposite direction of Earth's magnetic field when searching for food. That's an independent clause before food, so I'm going to mark IC at food. After that, we have in the northern hemisphere, the magnetic fields point down into the ground, but in the southern hemisphere, it points up toward the surface and away from worms' food sources. Okay, that's also an independent clause. So we have two independent clauses. We cannot connect them with just well or with no punctuation or with just a comma. So our answer there would have to be answer choice A. Here's another example with question 25. Which choice completes the text or conforms to conventions of standard English? Start with the answer choices. We got a bunch of pronouns. So I'll be looking for the noun I'm replacing. got scientists believe that unlike most other species of barnacle, turtle barnacles can dissolve the smelt-like secretions they use to attach blank to a turtle seashell, enabling the barnacles. Okay, so ultimately, we know our subject here is the turtle barnacles. Okay, so that's the noun we need to replace. Turtle barnacles can dissolve the smelt-like secretions they use to attach, so it would have to be themselves to a sea turtle shell. We know it's plural, so obviously we would get rid of A and we would get rid of D. Okay, we know it has to be themselves because we wouldn't state that turtle barnacles can dissolve the smelt-like secretions they use to attach them to a sea turtle shell. Okay, it is themselves. Okay, so our answer would have to be B. Here's another example how I recommend approaching questions where you ask to conform to the conventions of standard English. In this case, I'll look at my answer choices to start. I've got a bunch of different forms of the verb allow. So what I'm going to be looking to do is identify the number of my subject and also try to pay attention to tense as I read through this. We have a classic children's board game. Chutes and Ladders is a version of an ancient Nepalese game, Paramapada Sopanapada. In both games, players encounter good or bad spaces while traveling along a path. Landing on one of the good spaces blank a player to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal. All right, so I want to identify my subject. I have this prepositional phrase of on one of the good spaces, where on is the preposition that starts it off. So in order to identify your subject, make sure that you are getting rid of those prepositional phrases. So my subject here is landing. Landing is going to be singular. Look at my options. I have option A, allows. I'll use the he, they test here. So I would state he allows, but I would state they allow. So I see option D would have to be incorrect since allow is plural, but allows is singular. If you look at option B, we have are allowing. Well, are allowing, we would state they are allowing, but he is allowing. So we know that that's plural, so we can get rid of that as well. If you look at C, we have allowed. We would state they have allowed, but he has allowed. So once again, we see C would be plural as well. So our answer would have to be option A, since we need to maintain that singularity that is in our subject to the singularity that must match with our verb. So our answer would have to be A. Here's another example. So if we take a look at our answer choices, we've got equations and though. Anytime I have a transition word like though or however, I'm going to be looking to see if it needs to be on the left side of whatever punctuation or the right side. Or in other words, does it need to be contained with the first independent clause or the first clause, or does it need to be with the second clause or phrase? Okay, so that's one thing I'll be looking for. The second thing is we have a colon here. We have just commas here with no fanboys, and we have no fanboys or commas or any punctuation in D. And then on option C, we have a period. So what I'm going to look for is if we have two independent clauses, because that'll help me figure out punctuation as well. So I'm looking where to place though, and then if we've got two independent clauses. In 1943, in the midst of World War II, mathematics professor Grace Hopper was recruited by the U.S. military to help the war effort by solving complex equations. Hopper's subsequent career would involve more than just equations, though. As a pioneering computer programmer, is an introductory modifier to Hopper. Hopper would help usher in the digital age. That's an independent clause. We also have an independent clause with Hopper's subsequent career would involve more than just equations. So we have two independent clauses. Okay, we can't connect them with a comma and no fanboys or with no punctuation, so we get rid of B and D. So now the question is, does though need to come or be attached basically to the first independent clause or the second? Well, we have Hopper's subsequent career would involve more than equations though. Okay, that would need to be applied or connected to the first independent clause. We wouldn't state though and then have the introductory modifier after that, though as a pioneering computer programmer, Hopper would help usher in the digital age. Okay, that would make sense. We have to have that though connected to this first independent clause. Okay, the other thing that you can note is that your second independent clause here of as a pioneering computer programmer, Hopper would help usher in the digital age is illustrating the idea that came before it or the preceding idea prior to this colon, which is that her subsequent career would involve more than just equations, which we are illustrating, okay, by her being a computer programmer. Okay, the equations part was referring more to her being a mathematician. So we are illustrating this idea. Anytime you are illustrating the idea that came before it, okay, you will often be using a colon. Okay, so our answer has to be answer choice A. Here's another example. So if I take a look at my answer choices here, I've got Henry resumed his reign, the reign of Henry resumed, Henry's reign resumed, and it was Henry who resumed his reign. So as you can see here, basically what's getting switched around is what's at the beginning. First you have Henry, then you have the reign of Henry, then you have Henry's reign, then you have it was Henry. If you see that your subject is just being turned and switched around in the beginning, you're probably going to be looking at an introductory modifier. So in this case, if I take a look back up at where my blank is, I have upon recovering 2 years later. Okay, that's an introductory modifier. So what comes after it needs to be who it is modifying, who is recovering 2 years later. Okay, so let's go ahead and read through our text, figure out who that is. We have in 1453, English King Henry the VI became unfit to rule after falling gravely ill. As a result, Parliament appointed Richard, 3rd Duke of York, who had a strong claim to the English throne, to rule as protector. Upon recovering 2 years later, well, we know that King Henry is the one who fell ill, so he would be the one recovering. So what needs to come after this comma is King Henry. So we have option A, Henry, which is the subject that this introductory modifier is modifying. Okay, we have option B, the reign of Henry. It's not the reign of Henry that is recovering 2 years later. It's not Henry's reign that is recovering 2 years later. And it's not it that is recovering 2 years later. It is Henry himself. Okay, so we need to have the correct subject after the introductory modifier, so our answer there has to be answer choice A. Here's how I recommend that you approach transition questions on the digital SAT writing section. If you take a look at question 9, it states which choice completes the text with the most logical transition. Now, in contrast to questions that ask you to conform to the conventions of standard English, I actually recommend that you don't look at your answer choices first when dealing with transition questions. Here's how instead I think you should approach it. Start by reading through the text. Although novels and poems are considered distinct literary forms, many authors have created hybrid works that incorporate elements of both. Okay, so here we have a claim that many authors have created hybrid works that incorporate elements of both being the poems and the novels. And then we have Bernardine Evaristo's The Emperor's Babe. Blank is a verse novel, a book-length narrative complete with characters and a plot, but conveyed in short, crisp lines of poetry rather than prose. Okay, so this is an example of how novels and poems are not necessarily distinct, but instead how many authors have created hybrid works that incorporate elements of poetry and a normal novel, or in other words, a normal narrative. Okay, so as we can see, we are providing an example of the claim that we are given above. Okay, so I'd be looking for something like for example. Okay, so D would be perfect there. Now, the reason I recommend that you don't look at your answer choices first is because that could potentially sway you before you go through and you read the actual text. So I recommend you try to come up with your own answer choice first and then take a look at your options. That way you're less likely to be swayed by wrong answer choices. Here's another example. Once again, we have which choice completes the text in the most logical transition. We'll start by reading through. At 2 weeks old, the time their critical socialization period begins, wolves can smell but cannot yet see or hear. Domesticated dogs can see, hear, and smell by the end of 2 weeks. Okay, so in this case, we have a contrast. We have at 2 weeks old, wolves can smell, but they cannot see or hear, but domesticated dogs can see, hear, and smell by the end of 2 weeks. So it looks like we have a contrast. We'll keep reading. This relative lack of sensory input may help explain why wolves behave so differently around humans than dogs do. From a very young age, wolves are more wary and less exploratory. So in this case, we do have a contrast. So I'd be looking for something like domesticated dogs by contrast can see, hear, and smell by the end of 2 weeks. As we can see, we have by contrast as an option, so that works out perfectly. Okay, so our answer would have to be C. One thing I will make note of is that with digital SAT writing sections and the SAT writing section before it went digital, you tend to get very similar transition choices, and you tend to have similar transition themes across the different practice tests. Now, what I mean by this is you will often see situations where you would use something like, for example, where something exemplifies what came before it, or a contrast, or something where you're stating something in other words, or where you're giving, something for instance, which is kind of similar to for example. And some other ones that you might see are consequently, subsequently. Consequently being if something is a consequence of what came before it. Subsequently being if something came after what was talked about previously. So getting practice with the transition questions is very, very helpful because you often see similar transitions being used across the practice tests, which is obviously going to be indicative that those transitions are ones that the College Board would want you to know for the actual digital SAT. Here's another example. So once again, we have which choice completes the text most logical transition. I'll start by filling in the blank with what I expect to be there after I do my read through, and then I'll go through my answer choices. We have researchers Helena Mihaljevic, Brandt, Lucia Santamaria, and Marco Tolny report that while mathematicians may have traditionally worked alone, evidence points to a shift in the opposite direction. So one thing I'll point out here is anytime I have any sort of shift or any sort of indication that we have some sort of change going on, or even some sort of something that's staying the same, I want to pay attention to that on a transition question. In this case, we have a shift in the opposite direction of working alone, so presumably working together. Then we have mathematicians are choosing to collaborate with peers, a trend illustrated by the rise in the number of mathematics publications credited to multiple authors. Okay, so in this case, we are stating that they are choosing to work with peers. That's pretty much an example of what came before it. So I would probably be looking for something along the lines of, for example, here. Okay, if we look at our options, we've got option A, similarly. Well, it's not similar to what came before it. Okay, we're just kind of illustrating what we previously claimed. If we look at option B, for this reason, it's not a consequence of what came before it, so we can get rid of B. Okay, what came before it did not cause mathematicians choosing to collaborate with their peers. If we look at option C, furthermore, we're not adding on to what came before, we're illustrating it. Okay, if we look at option D, we have increasingly. Okay, increasingly, mathematicians are choosing to collaborate with their peers, a trend illustrated by the rise in the number of mathematics publications credited to multiple authors. So as you can see, D would have to be our answer there. Now, obviously, that's not the same as what I came up with as for example, but when we state that increasingly mathematicians are choosing to collaborate with their peers, well, is that a good transition from what came before, which stated that we are moving in the opposite direction of working alone? Yes, because the opposite of working alone would be an increase in collaboration. Okay, so obviously that's a great transition there, and it is illustrating what came before. Okay, so our answer would have to be D. Here's how I recommend answering questions on the digital SAT writing section, where you're presented with a student's or someone's notes, and then you have to answer questions following that. The first thing I recommend that you do is take a look at what your actual prompt is. Okay, and the prompt will basically be the last part before which choice most effectively uses relevant information from the notes to accomplish this goal. So when I say prompt, I'm referring to the section right here. Okay, so the student wants to present the study and its findings. From here, once I know the prompt, I identify what I want to look for as I do my read through. In this case, it's pretty broad. It's just the study and its findings. Okay, so I'll go back up. Let's do the read through. Okay, pterosaurs were flying reptiles that existed millions of years ago. In 2021 study, ACT analyzed fragments of pterosaur jaw bones located in the Sahara Desert. She was initially unsure if the bones belonged to a juvenile or adult Pterosaurus. She used advanced microscope techniques to determine that the bones had few growth lines relative to the bones of fully grown pterosaurs. She concluded that the bones belonged to juveniles. Okay, so the findings is that the bones belong to juveniles. Okay, the study is ultimately whether these jaw bones are from that of a juvenile or an adult. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our options. We got option A. In 2021, CT studied pterosaur jaw bones and was initially unsure if the bones belonged to juveniles or adults. That does not present the findings, so we can get rid of option A. When you're dealing with questions like this, you need to be strict and make sure that you're answering all parts of the prompt. This one does not include findings, so we get rid of A. B. The jaw bones located in the Sahara Desert were the focus of a 2021 study. Also does not talk about the findings. Option C. In a 2021 study, CT used advanced microscope techniques to analyze the jawbones of pterosaurs, flying reptiles that existed millions of years ago. Once again, we do not discuss the findings in option C, so we got to get rid of it. And then we take a look at option D. In a 2021 study, CT determined that pterosaur jawbones located in the Sahara Desert had few growth lines relative to the bones of fully grown pterosaurs and thus belonged to juveniles. Okay, right there, we do both a presenting of the study. If we go up, our prompt, present the study and its findings. We do both of those. Answer there has to be D. Here's another example of how I recommend that you approach questions where you're given a set of notes and asked to do something with it. Okay, in this case, we see that our prompt is the student wants to compare the two women's contributions to the March on Washington. And then we have the generic part of the question, which is which choice most effectively uses relevant information from the notes to accomplish this goal. Okay, so we're going to focus in right here. Student wants to compare the two women's contributions to the March on Washington. So since I'm looking for a comparison, I'm going to look for things that are different and possibly things that are the same as well. So we have African-American women played prominent roles in the civil rights movement, including at the famous 1963 March on Washington. Civil rights activist Anna Hedgeman, one of the march's organizers, was a political advisor who had worked for President Truman. Civil rights activist Daisy Bates was a well-known journalist and advocate for school desegregation. So it looks like they have two different positions. And then we have Hedgeman worked behind the scenes to make sure a woman was included in the lineup of speakers at the march. Bates was the sole woman to speak, delivering a brief but memorable address to the cheering crowd. Okay, so Hedgeman worked behind the scenes and Bates was a speaker. Looks like is the main difference there. The similarity would be that they both had important contributions to the March on Washington. So we've got option A, Hedgeman and Bates contributed to the march in different ways. In different ways, Bates, for example, delivered a brief but memorable address. All right, so are we comparing the two women's contributions? Well, we say that they contributed in different ways, and then we only state the way that Bates contributed. I would prefer an option where we talk about the way that they each contributed in their own distinct way. So I'm going to leave this one as neutral for now. Let's take a look at B. Hedgeman worked in politics and helped organize the march, while Bates was a journalist and school desegregation advocate. Well, we never mentioned Bates's role in the March on Washington there, so I'm going to get rid of B. Option C states, although Hedgeman worked behind the scenes to make sure a woman speaker was included, Bates was the sole woman to speak at the march. Okay, this is much better than option A. Okay, option A states they both contributed to the march in different ways, but then we only discuss how Bates contributed. Okay, so we can get rid of A now. Okay, C is much better because it states how Hedgeman contributed. Okay, she worked behind the scenes to make sure a woman was included. And then we also discuss how Bates contributed, being the sole one to speak at the march. And obviously these are both different, so that's a great comparison. Okay, we can take a look at D as well here. We have many African-American women, including Bates and Hedgeman, fought for civil rights, but only one spoke at the march. The focus here is not on comparing Bates and Hedgeman, so we can get rid of D. Keep in mind your prompt. The prompt states the student wants to compare the two women's contributions specifically to the March on Washington. Okay, so our answer would have to be answer choice C. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and consider sending a super thanks to help support my channel. Additionally, please drop a comment below letting me know what videos you want me to make in the future. And if you are looking for additional educational services that I offer, please check out my website, haydenrhodea.com.